Welcome to Amplex's webinar. I see we have a number of folks already joined us, and I'm sure a few more will trickle in. But in the interest of time, to get in front of the great content that we have for all of you today, I think we should kick things off. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Chris Fanning. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at Amplix. And this webinar is around the lessons we can all learn from Apple Intelligence and what our IT leaders that we work with day in and day out can learn about that and the impacts within the AI stack. As I mentioned, I'm the Chief Revenue Officer. My sales team, account management teams, and our subject matter experts, along with the experts that you see here on the panel, and we'll get into their intros in a second, are fielding questions around AI every day. And it doesn't matter if it's around cybersecurity or customer experience or data governance. We're being peppered with questions all day long. And since we're kind of in this, new space race when it comes to AI and everybody kind of developing new tools and bringing them to market, we are, evolving kind of how we handle the questions and how we're guiding our customers. And so we found it important to have webinars like this to further the education, because most recently, and why we're here today, Apple announced at their Worldwide Developers Conference, WWDC, around their new offering. They did that back in June and have already come out with some new data around it. And it really is around, and kind of still in kind of a beta format. And with Scott Weiner, who I'm going to introduce in a second, is going to give us more of a high-level overview of Apple Intelligence. But really, the new format for Apple Intelligence, or at least the start, is around enhanced writing tools, enhanced photo tools, and advancing Siri to sound more natural and lifelike. So why this is important into the marketplace is basically around kind of the personalization that this will create. From a benefit standpoint, when we're seeing on the optimization tools that are being out there from an AI perspective, like Microsoft's Copilot, this is going to bring more advancement to the Apple devices, which there's sheer number of devices that are out there where Apple owns 20% of the market share of all mobile devices, and that's just mobile devices, not all the other smart devices that they have out there in the market. But this does continue to pose security and data risks that we'll get into during this conversation. And so this is, this format here today and within our panelists are really to uncover kind of how we could be leveraging it, but what to be on the lookout for, and, to always be mindful of the new enhancements that are coming out within Apple Intelligence or any other AI product. So with that being said, I'm going to open it up for bios from our panelists. Scott, why don't you kick us off there?
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Scott Weiner. I'm from a company called New Eon, N-E-U-E-O-N. I'm a strategic technology advisor. My focus these days is definitely on AI. I'm the AI lead at New Eon. What we do is we try to help companies with their technology strategy and make sure that they're using technology effectively and that they're building technology in best practices ways in terms of the industry. And of course, AI has become a big part of that. And Apple Intelligence now, as it encroaches on the organizations, feeds into how we're trying to help companies with their strategy. And so that's why I'm here today.
Right. Adam, Winston, why don't we kick it off to you?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm the Chief Security Officer with a company called Zero. We help small and medium businesses block cyber threats. So I'm here to advise on all things risk, threat, vulnerability, and keep people up to date on the best technologies to use to stop attacks and what technologies introduce new attack vectors. So that's what I'm going to focus on today.
Right. Dan Frasco, you're up.
Thanks so much. For those that I haven't met, I'm Dan Frasco. I'm responsible for all things security here at Amplix, as well as infrastructure, cloud, and things in AI as well.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And Robbie, why don't you round us out?
Great. Thank you, guys. Looking forward to this. Robbie Gulry. I am the field CTO for a company called Rapid Scale. Um, Often I think about AI in the context of not only AI, but how it has implications in cloud and workloads in the cloud. And I also start thinking through what is the security implication. So here, my perspective is really not looking at AI just in a box or as an application, but looking at the whole ecosystem.
Great. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. And to kind of level set for those that are unfamiliar with Apple Intelligence, we're going to kick it off with Scott from New Eon to kind of, give us a high-level overview of what's being brought to market and what we should expect from Apple Intelligence in the future.
Yeah, and just kind of an overarching view of, I think, why this could be a really valuable conversation today. So just at a high level, Apple Intelligence is a set of AI features that will use powerful language and image processing capabilities to make Apple devices more helpful and personalized. As Chris mentioned, writing, others are smart notifications that are more in tune with the kind of work you're doing. The Siri enhancements are going to do, I think, two things in particular. One is you're going to be able to have longer conversations. They won't be, one question interactions. They'll remember information longer, context. The image processing tools will just continue to get more advanced anyway. And then audio transcription and some of the things we're going to do with audio are going to be fascinating. But the bigger picture is we seem to be at a critical turning point in the evolution of AI. Apple's introduction of Apple Intelligence is really a significant step towards advanced AI capabilities directly integrated into consumer devices. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, as I would say, in terms of we're going to have more and more consumer devices that are really smart. What we used to call smart, Alexa, Siri, things like that, are dumb compared to what's coming. So on the one hand, though, AI is data hungry. And so anytime we say we're going to add AI to our devices, what we're saying is we're going to need access to a lot of information, which is exactly what Apple Intelligence is looking for, is access to your personal information so it can be more personalized. And the thought of employees with consumer devices looking for data is daunting. We do need to consider the corporate security and governance concerns. In fact, that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is dealing with governance issues with companies. But on the other hand, Apple's approach to edge computing and data privacy has some interesting lessons we might be able to learn from and apply in our own organizations. And I hope we talk about that today. And I think there may be some really good lessons for us all. For instance, Apple emphasizes privacy as its core architectural choice. This was a choice they make. It's not just marketing, it's kind of the way they think about this. So by processing data on the device, this idea of edge computing in a secure environment that also can translate to a secure private cloud when it needs to, they're setting a new standard in data protection, or at least they're attempting to, and they're processing data locally whenever possible, which minimizes risk of data breaches. So there's some benefits to this, and there's some risks that we'll discuss. And companies can adopt similar strategies to protect their sensitive information. In other words, we can learn from what Apple is doing, and that's really the point of today. I do want to stress, though, and I think this is going to come up a lot, is that with this advancement, the reality is now the line between personal devices and professional devices and capabilities is becoming more and more blurred. And as this happens, it presents new challenges for IT departments in terms of policy, device management. So in essence, Apple's intelligence kind of exemplifies where the industry is likely heading. Integrating powerful AI while prioritizing user privacy and security. IT leaders can learn from this by rethinking their own AI strategies, focusing on layered security, transparency, and the management of AI capabilities across devices and applications. At the same time, these devices do present new potential concerns for the enterprise, and I think that's what we're going to talk about next.
Great, thanks, Scott. Adam, Scott kind of touched upon it on how Apple, kind of overemphasizes the privacy aspect of their products. Can you walk us through a little bit of the architecture within, Apple's ecosystem and how they're bringing this to market and containerizing it, so to speak?
So I mean, there's no secret here, right? Of the Magnificent Seven, right? Your Googles, your Amazon, your Microsofts, your Metas. The Apple's coming out sort of last with their story on artificial intelligence, right? As you look at the company, right? It's no secret if you look at their earnings that they haven't necessarily been moving a lot of hardware, which is about 80% of the company's revenue, right? Is to come from iPhone and of course MacBook sales. And so obviously, in order to sort of juice those sales, as they look at 2025 and then beyond, they want to try to incorporate new features that make their handsets more attractive. So you shift off the iPhone 14 to the 15, 16 and on, right? And as a result, they had a sort of longer period of time to think about how they were going to incorporate AI or any relationships with companies like OpenAI and ChatGPT into their service. And so at the Worldwide Developer Conference, what they sort of announced was two things. One's that obviously focused on the fact that you needed new hardware in order to use a lot of the features that are going to come out on the handsets and more modern hardware when it comes to the MacBook. So, this is, of course, incentivizing people to go to a hardware upgrade. What that means is a lot of the AI will be running on the actual compute, on the hardware that you are getting in these devices. And they're acknowledging two things with that statement. The first is that their AI will be used to do on-device functions or enhance the existing applications that they're basically now admitting were not as good, right? Your series and your deterministic kind of legacy software wasn't actually building a lot of value for customers. Most people sort of joke about how Siri was bad at interpreting messages and not able to really, automate tasks. But now they're sort of saying, well, with this new sort of AI training we've got, we're going to get new features. You're going to get new value out of these handsets, and we're going to make sure that that's contained. So the second thing they're acknowledging is their previous features didn't work, and they needed this to sort of help out. But that the AI in some way needs to be contained, right? And they're starting to throw around the word private cloud. Apple's not new to cloud. iCloud and other kinds of parts of their service, whether it's the developer ecosystem or other things that those apps on device can connect to. We've all heard a lot about TikTok and what can they monitor, what can they see. Apple gives them the rights on the software to allow them access to certain parts of the operating system, which they've kind of said, is their sort of prime MO, is to try to secure the operating system apps from each other, the camera, the voice, the data from app to app. But they've also had cases like the incident in 2019 where they demonstrated that contractors could access all the voice messages you were sending to Siri, right? And so they're very conscious of the fact that they don't have a great track record. It's just saying, oh, it's a private cloud, and just sort of leaving it at that and not being transparent about the architecture of who gets access to that cloud, what sort of applications are going to get integrations to this. And of course, people are sort of looking at the ChatGPT linkage to say, well, okay, you're going to leave things on device. You're going to have a private cloud, but at some point, you're going to have some interface with ChatGPT and potentially others. And so they're very cautious to say how much privacy and limitations those applications will have to the user's data, their phone, their video, the hardware that obviously I think people would be very uncomfortable sort of allowing into the hands of thousands of app developers and ecosystem partners. So the architecture is promoted as contained on the device and contained in a private cloud. And Apple's now beginning to sort of discuss the implications of how data will be shared between different devices, what controls you have. And of course, that's going to matter for the enterprise in terms of what settings they want to turn on when this shows up to the iPhones accessing their email.
And Adam, what do you think the overall impact for customers is with that architecture and kind of the future designs there? What is that going to have from a customer level perspective?
So, if you look at Apple's customers, there's a lot. There's certainly 2.2 billion devices in circulation. They're 8.8% market share in terms of the market of the iPhone, 20%, right? So you have a significant amount of the market that's both consumer/enterprise, right? It's this BYOD concept, and so the idea is that if we're talking about photos, we're talking about enhancements to writing and text and other things on the device, and we're accessing corporate resources or reviewing corporate resources with this AI, it's important to understand that whatever that ecosystem is deploying on top of your corporate data, this is now a layer, an overlay to potentially your existing corporate environment, right? And so, whether it's going to be, meetings, I doubt very few, if any, enterprise customers use things like FaceTime or other places that are, exclusively Apple. But should those things get converted to video, and now the search capability in the video on the device has certain indexing of the video, anything talked about on that video could potentially be, potential for loss, right? If that ecosystem has access to it. So from an enterprise perspective, it's very important to understand how the architecture is interfacing with your existing applications, data, content, how that handset, how that hardware is going to be able to share, secure, manage the connections between both, because frankly, it will be there, right? There will be a connective tissue between the two. And it's up to enterprises now to sort of create the fence, create the monitoring, create the automation to make sure that their users are safe while using this. They didn't necessarily highlight a lot of that, which I'm hoping we can do on this webinar about what features they've given you to secure your devices from this new change.
Great, that's a good segue. So, AI is obviously encroaching on IT corporate networks. So Dan, I'm going to throw it over to you to kind of add in some context around, some of the cyber aspects and what IT leaders can be doing to kind of fortify with, kind of the advent of this AI technology.
Yeah, I mean, so I think some of the things that just came out recently from Apple is the ability to control some of these aspects of Apple Intelligence. They put out some MDM controls that allow you, at least I think there's 7 of them right now, that allow you to kind of control what the enterprises allow folks to use. That's obviously given that you're using MDM inside your enterprise. So I think that's a big step forward, at least in this area, to actually have these abilities to augment what they're allowing on the network. And that, that's going to help in some ways, right? I think what came up earlier in the conversation as well is, the fact that I think a lot of enterprises are need to get to putting in policies in place around AI, right? I mean, that's kind of the first step with all this. And I think that comes along with that is putting in some of these MDM controls, seeing what people need to actually go out and start to control in these environments.
Adam, anything to add there from a cyber perspective, being one of our leading cyber experts on the conversation?
Sure. So I guess we should start with just the tabling of the risks. What are the risks, right? The first is that if you're starting to copy data or inputs and outputs, right, and the inputs and outputs could be documentation, it could be source code, it could be text. What's coming out could be lies, right? It could be hallucinations that could put downstream liability on you, right? We've had lawyers already fired for using, ChatGPT for, inventing cases that never existed. And so, obviously security awareness is very important here because a lot of people are going to get introduced in some form or another, whether it's Apple Intelligence or a Zoom companion AI or some other type of AI assistant, what the inputs are, what the outputs are, and where that data is in the interim. Part of AI is to train models. If you think about Apple Intelligence, right, they've trained on a lot of public data. They haven't given people access to iCloud to train these models and to figure out what your face might look like and who you are, for example. But the programs need to be knowledgeable to be useful. So they've been trained on a lot of text and internet scrapers and things like that allow them to interpret your questions a lot more accurately. Can you draw something with dog ears? They need to know what a dog is. So when it comes to the security, those MDM features are going to be focused on which ones of those new features you want to allow on device. So they're feature-based MDM security tools, meaning do you want to allow the new emoji generator to be enabled? Do you want to allow the writing assistant to be enabled in email or on the keyboard? Do you want, the ability for, photo enhancement or photo searches to be enhanced with this? And so if you look at the way that they've sort of designed the security program, it's mostly just being able to enable and disable the feature altogether. They used to have this concept of what was called open-in. And the idea was that for a long time, when they introduced handsets specifically to the enterprise, they wanted to create kind of a workspace concept. So if you remember companies like Good Technology or AirWatch or other, they used to containerize the corporate applications and assets on the phone separately from this. And so there's no talk of being able to do that specifically, to say, hey, we can leave Apple Intelligence in place, but please disable it for the corporate Outlook client that's on the device, right? And so this is going to force enterprises to either say you can't have the feature at all, or you can have it, but please use it safely and responsibly, which gets back to explaining the risk and understanding that they're not supposed to send, like Samsung did, blueprints up to this thing that force the company to have to say, well, we just lost the blueprints to our new chip. We're going to have to turn this AI thing off for everybody, and then everybody loses, right? So it's incumbent on IT security leaders to explain the features and take a good approach to making sure we don't make mistakes, because that almost always leads to turning the thing off.
So Adam, I think one of the things that goes along with this is education, right? We've talked about that a lot, right? A lot of this always goes back to the end user being educated, understanding what's out there. I mean, AI is throughout a lot of applications. I think you mentioned one, right? So Outlook, It's inside Chrome. It's everywhere, right? And so educating the user and having policies not only around Apple Intelligence, but general AI policy, having people understand, what data is going anywhere. DLP policies need to be augmented. I mean, there's a bunch of things that go along with this, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Dan. And that's a good point to bring up to Scott around, regulatory compliance and like the privacy aspects of kind of AI and how we're as kind of Dan mentioned, kind of kind of monitoring that behavior too internally to make sure that we're set up for success when launching AI applications like intelligence. So I'll hand it over to you to kind of review some of the regulatory aspects of this.
Sure. And, I spent a lot of time with companies talking about governance because there's two types of governance we need to think about. One is around the regulatory aspects of this, which we'll get into, and the other is data and how you're managing your data and the data flow. I can't tell you how many times we go into companies that say, I've got this great idea for AI, the way we want to use it within our company, either to enhance our workflow, optimize our processes, or build a product. But they haven't thought through both the data aspects and also the governance piece. And a big part of that is what we just talked about, which is training. Employees really need to have some level of AI digital literacy at this point. It is no longer acceptable to think that we can put our head in the sand and say, this isn't about us, we don't do AI. Everyone's now carrying around these devices in their pockets that have incredible power, and they're only going to get more powerful and more data hungry. So we have to deal with this. Now, the US is actually a little behind. So I'm going to go through some of the regulatory stuff a little bit. I'll start with the EU. So the EU came out with something called the AI Act, and this came into force this year. And it's setting the world's first comprehensive AI regulations. Now, there's pluses and minuses to it. It classifies AI systems based on risk level. So unacceptable, high, limited, minimal risk. And I would think that Apple Intelligence probably categorizes as high. Things like employment systems, credit scoring systems, law enforcement, things that can have real impact on people and society have a high risk. And then they have a profile for what you need to do if you're in those areas. So the implication for the enterprises are that, currently, I should say this first, currently Apple Intelligence isn't available anywhere, so that's not a problem, but it's probably not going to be available on phones in the EU anytime soon after it's released here, mainly because of the Digital Marketing Act, not because of the AI Act. The Digital Marketing Act that was in Europe basically says that there's a level of interoperability that they're looking for in phones. Apple's saying that it impacts their privacy capabilities, and so they don't want to do it. So that's being worked out. But in the meantime, it means that if you're talking about Apple Intelligence and Europe, you're really talking about desktops. However, if a company is using Apple Intelligence on a Mac to process data, they're going to be considered a user of an AI system under the EU AI Act. And this gets a little complicated, so I won't get too much into the depth of it. But basically, if you're established or located in the EU, or you're creating outputs with Apple Intelligence or any other AI, and you're using those in the EU, then you fall under this user capability if you're doing it for business purposes. So all of a sudden, you can imagine, for instance, if you did a mass marketing and you created it with Apple Intelligence, theoretically, you could fall under this if you're sending it to everyone in Europe, for instance. So you need to ensure if you do fall under this, that your AI system is used as intended. Implementing human oversights have to be in place. That's key. And by the way, you should be doing this anyway. And then you have to monitor the system's operation and keep logs of the AI system activity. So those are just examples of things that the EU Act will do. As you move from looking at Europe, and you can start to look at, let's say, China is the other big one. China is doing a lot in this space right now. Enterprises who are using Apple Intelligence have to be really vigilant about their compliance with both U.S. export controls, because we have a lot of controls on what you can send to China in terms of AI technology, and then Chinese AI regulations. So the regulatory landscape is really complex and evolving, and it requires ongoing attention to ensure that you're being lawful in the use of AI technologies, especially in these international contexts. It's difficult for an IT organization that doesn't have good, legal partner that can stay on top of these laws, because they are changing rapidly. China imposes really strict controls on data processing and cross-border data transfers. In fact, Apple can't release Apple Intelligence there, I believe, until they at least find a partner that can host in China, in country. So I don't believe anything's happened there yet. China is requiring data to be processed in country only. So in terms of the export controls I mentioned, Apple Intelligence is going to have to be aware that technologies may be subject to export controls. So I don't really know exactly how that's going to play out yet, but enterprises need to be cautious about transferring any AI technology or knowledge that they derive from Apple Intelligence to Chinese entities. So there's a lot to think about when you start thinking internationally with AI at this point. And if enterprises are using Apple Intelligence in product development, they really do need to ensure that their products and services do not violate these export laws. So here's what I would recommend. Conduct thorough assessments of how you're using Apple Intelligence within your organization once it's rolled out. Really understand, and that means having an engagement with your stakeholders and employee training, as we talked about. Implement, you have to have a robust compliance program if you're going to be working with these countries, and definitely seek legal counsel. Don't go by what I'm saying on the panel right now, but make sure. The U.S. regulatory landscape, however, is kind of messy right now, and it's everything I just said times 10. So basically, right now we have a patchwork of state laws. There's about, I think, 45 states have introduced AI bills, separate bills, and 31 states have already enacted some type of AI legislation or resolution, not to mention all the privacy and data laws at the state level. So depending on what state you're talking about, there are different implications to you as well. Then the federal government's working on things. There's a giant overarching bill that's bringing like 9 bills together in the House of Science, Space Technology Committee, but that's probably going to turn into something real, but today we don't have that. So we just have this patchwork of laws that you have to be aware of right now. Hopefully some of this will get worked out. If you look at things like what California's done, both with their privacy laws like the CCPA, Virginia has a similar one. Those are probably good guidance to what's going to be the privacy framework. And then some of the other laws, like Colorado has one around political speech. There's a lot of state laws that are probably going to get rolled up, the good ideas into these bills, maybe some of the bad ideas too. So what I'm really trying to say about the regulatory framework right now is it's moving, it's messy, and you really need to have someone in the organization or have a partner that can help you with this, that is staying on top of this. Not most people don't have the time in their day to keep on track of this, so you do need to do this. If you want, there are websites I can give you afterwards. I can get for you that actually track this, track all the legislation across the country on one website, so you literally can see how it's doing. The main things I would say is you need to think about data access, how you do compliance checks, and make sure your BYOD policies are up to date, reflecting AI. In fact, not just your BYOD, also your acceptable use policies as well. Those need to be reflecting the way you want AI to be used within your organization. Anyway, I hope that's helpful.
No, that was great content, Scott. Thank you very much. And, when we're talking about regulatory compliance and cyber, the main things that come to mind is company data and their IP. So I'm going to throw it over to Robbie to kind of walk us through what, the IT leaders on this webinar and others that will listen to the recording should be aware of when we're talking about, being very protective around our data and IP and how that gets impacted by all of these different AI offerings, especially Apple Intelligence.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I did a little bit of an inventory on my phone before the webinar. I found 3,500. In fact, I wrote it down: 3,527 screenshots. The vast majority are business oriented. I found 69 sort of video recordings or screen recordings, and I found over 200 audio recordings. I walk around and record to myself all the time. A lot of those are very proprietary to my business, to my customer base, and to the things that I do day to day. Amazing what Apple Intelligence is promising to do. It's going to be able to summarize those transcriptions. It's going to be able to deliver me notifications that are delivered, through basically a better version of Siri. It's going to give me the ability to summarize emails, and I get hundreds just like everybody else on this webinar on a daily basis. So from a user perspective, I'm quite excited about the potential efficiency gains of this. But from a IT leadership perspective, data leakage perspective, this introduces all kinds of issues. And that's just on the Apple side. We talked about Grammarly. A lot of folks use Grammarly to kind of update their day-to-day writings. Well, what are you actually putting into Grammarly? Where is it going? How is it uploaded to the cloud? What's being done to that data once it's up onto wherever Grammarly runs their platform? And that's just one example. So we can go on and on. I often will upload a personal image into something like Stable Fusion, analyze the image, and it'll come back with some results. Great in my personal life, but also pretty dangerous from a corporate data leakage perspective.
Great, thanks. Scott, anything to add there?
Well, just the copyright law is also a moving target right now. The Copyright Office currently looks at anything that's produced with AI as not being copyrightable. So if you built something, let's say for a marketing campaign, and you generated it with AI and you didn't do a lot of human editing on it, it's going to not be something that you own. And so you got to consider that. The other thing is, because these systems are being trained on all this stuff, like Robbie was saying, I think you got to understand that your employees are going to be generating things that may actually infringe on someone's copyright, and you may not know it until it's too late. So you do have to be very careful, and that's why the education piece is so important, that people understand what they can and can't do with this information and where this information comes from. And I do encourage you to go look at the Copyright Office site, because they have some really good information. And one of the things you can do there that's really interesting is, anytime someone applies for a copyright and it's denied, they have information about what happened and why. And you can learn from their failures to get the copyright. And then when they do get the copyright, you can learn from what was considered acceptable as well. And so there's a lot of interesting information. Now, all of this said is around what's going on today. As the technology gets better, one of the things they're talking about is like AI fingerprints, so that when something's generated with AI, there'll be metadata embedded and so on. So some of this will get a little easier over time in terms of automating the tools to check these things. But at the moment, it requires a lot of human oversight, a lot of training to make sure people understand what these things are good and not good for.
Yeah, I think when I add to what Scott's saying, I'm actually going to steal, Scott, one of your statements you made a few days ago. We used to worry about shadow IT, right? Like we used to worry about marketing going rogue and using tools that weren't approved by IT, and I think we have to now worry about shadow AI. This is frankly today less of a technology problem. I mean, there's obviously a lot of technology that's evolving, but we really got to think in terms of people, process, policy, and before all those three Ps, you got to think about purpose. What is the business purpose? And then as a decision maker and a leader in an organization, you got to kind of, balance the risk and reward. From a copywriting perspective, it is as gray as the policy side today. It will evolve. I mean, you have human authorship concerns. What percentage of this work was done by a human and what percentage was done by a machine? That's interesting.
Probably might be having some technical difficulties here, so I didn't know if it was my connection or not. So
I wasn't sure it was me too.
Okay, so we're going to move on and kind of go back a little bit to the architecture. I wanted to bring Dan Frasco a little bit more into the conversation here. Dan, what did Apple do right from kind of in developing these new features within Apple Intelligence and kind of the infrastructure around it and kind of the reusing model that they built here? Can you go down that path a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to shake anybody up and say that Apple did something right. I may confuse people. But I mean, so I guess the one thing that I would want to say is that they did kind of play off of Google. Google did a lot of this a long time ago, right? There was a lot of this in place before with the Android intelligence model and stuff, and so a lot of this follows the same stuff that they did, right? They do a lot of it on board, right? They offloaded a bunch of the stuff. Apple actually, upticked it, right? So they did a better job with security, I think, in this case. The thing that Google probably did that people probably think is a little bit better is that they're actually allowing older hardware to run the stuff versus where Apple's forcing newer hardware, right? But they didn't reinvent the wheel here, right? They relied on sort of the same sort of architectural design, I think in general, right, that someone else did. They didn't reinvent the wheel, which I think is something that kind of is a good thing, right? They didn't just go out and they're reusing partners that are out there. They didn't try and build their own AI and stuff. I think Adam mentioned that earlier. So there's some good things that came out of this as well, I think.
Great. No, those are good points. Apple Intelligence is just, another example of AI sneaking into the corporate network, as we kind of mentioned earlier. What are some of the other vectors that AI is entering into enterprises? Robbie, why don't you kick us off since I see that you're back and fully
Back, yeah.
active with us. So why
Yeah.
don't you kick off that conversation point?
The wonders of hotel Wi-Fi. Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, and I don't know how much of that you heard, there's a lot of gray area around the whole copyright issue. There's a whole lot of gray area around the intellectual property issue. And then at the same time, there's a whole lot of gray area around, sort of what aspects of the technology do I want to implement today to basically be a better, stronger business, right? So a lot of these questions are raising, frankly, even more questions. And ultimately, what I would encourage IT leaders to think about is, again, weigh the risks with the rewards. And we've all talked about it. Scott talked about it. I think Adam talked about it at the beginning of this webinar, is without end user sort of awareness training, making sure they understand. A lot of people don't think about it. A lot of folks that I talk to day to day, internally and externally, they're pretty casual with being able to use these tools day to day to basically just get their job done, whether it's ChatGPT or Perplexity. I think before we do anything moving forward, the user community across all these organizations have to be educated.
Great. Adam, what are your thoughts there in terms of other kind of vectors that AI is sneaking into within the corporate tech stack?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've seen a lot of corporate examples of over-indexing on this, right? Especially in San Francisco venture capital, right? There's a lot of people that are, probably way overfunded in terms of their ability to disrupt the legal field with their inaccurate AI models. Some of these things somewhat intractable, but I think if you look at total cost of ownership and trying to assess it now, we're still early days, but everybody's tending to use a lot of these assistants, right? I can't think of somebody that hasn't used ChatGPT to write an email or check source code. I can't think of somebody that hasn't used, Gemini or Bard or whatever it was, originally sort of embedded in when they tried it out, or the meta version of it. So the idea is that just like Shadow IT, they're bringing a lot of these things into your daily lives. They're not thinking about copyright implications of generating that, picture, that perfect picture to send in the mass email. They're not thinking of the copyright on the source code they just edited with their JavaScript editing or whatever with ChatGPT or Copilot or one of these. And I think that people seem to forget the risk. When we were at the leadership summit, a lot of the security controls around these AI models, like what's the target, right? So everybody brings this stuff to work. What's the problem, right? We all talked about data loss being on the phone when it was BYOD in the mid 2000s, right? For us, it was important to demonstrate that once you aggregate all this data, the security controls on the kinds of questions you can ask it and the data that it generates are really just sort of these simple pre-filters. It's not native to the actual ML or AI or anything that they use to train the data, not to know and not to generate sensitive information or destructive answers to questions. It's these simple filters that they put on the front of it. So what am I saying by saying that, right? I'm saying that the target for Apple Intelligence is that private cloud of information that may be storing a lot of the prompts in some way that you've then aggregated in this area, right? Just like stealing those Siri messages may have been very important because who knows what you've been saying in these passive recordings? Who knows how long that dictation's been active? What if I wanted all of Rob's screenshots and his messages and all those things? How can I get those? And the reason that I think Apple is so specific on saying private cloud on device only is that they're saying it's sheltered away from people, because if they were to be able to interact with it, there is an inherent risk in them being able to manipulate the prompt or manipulate the API or manipulate something in it to get it to generate the answers that would put everybody at risk, that would leak the data. I don't know if you guys have been following the stories of Slack this week. Disney dumped Slack for having it hacked, and 10,000 plus channels of the internal Disney Slack were posted online, terabytes of this stuff. And they said they wiped it, but there's a whole bunch of mirror sites just sitting there showing everything from Disney's approach to AI to what they might do in new movies to what they might do to writers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So a pretty massive problem for them. And before them, it was Uber, and before them, it was somebody else, right?
It was Zoom.
And so it was Zoom.
Right.
And so the math here is we are going to hear stories like that about companies like the people on this webinar, working with this software and sort of saying, well, I thought I was secure, I thought it was protected, I thought I could have these internal communications using this tool, and lo and behold, they could, get in and pull everything and get out, right? And so this really does kind of say the ecosystem, back to Scott's point about where's the legislation, it's at the state AG, privacy design level, where each state kind of has their own right to develop the policies on how these technologies should be used. That just creates architecture problems for the people making AI, but for the users of AI who have probably a massively distributed workforce and everybody accessing potentially centralized data resources that they're not even sure which data center it's in Virginia, is it in Oregon? I don't know, right? And so the concept is that we've lost a lot of control by moving to this SaaS design. We're losing further control with these AI products, and they're not more secure than any of the deterministic stuff we've been building in software clouds for the past 30, 40 years. The idea is that we are going to see new ways that they're going to attack this infrastructure and get the data. We're going to see these leaks become public. And I think the companies that are looking to adopt these technologies really need to have a better diligence apparatus for the tools that are going to be enabled in this sort of shadow IT, the co-pilots and the Zooms and the Read AIs and all these other things, and know how to prosecute the things that they're saying, learn how to understand where their data is and how long it's being stored. And that speaks to sort of some of the things I think we want to leave behind at the end of this webinar. But that's what I think is going to happen. People are unaware that you can ask this thing a question and get the data from inside it, and that you're going to end up with more Slack-like news stories with Disney in the future, and unless the consumers and the enterprises are the ones changing. And to all the points we keep saying, data loss and hardening and security and controls and all these other things, I think most people would say, oh, okay, that's what we're supposed to do. We'll do the minimum. We'll implement those 7 settings in the MDM, and we'll make a decision on it. And that's the last time we'll think about it. And then they never work on the data that goes in or out of the app, and they never think about it until the day they're breached. And then they have to look up each state AG's laws to avoid those civil penalties. They have to, look at, their customer confidence in what happened, even though it's not necessarily their company that had the problem, right? So I think we have to do a little better here to get smart about how we do this, or we're going to see the same outcomes as we do with Slack.
Oh,
And I
so
wanna
I
add-
don't want to harp on the Slack thing, but so the Slack thing was what? It was user education. It was a guy that had Slack on his home computer, right? And basically they infiltrated his own computer, right? And so that's where that one started, right? And so that was obviously a really, really bad thing. But what does that come down to? Policy, someone doing something stupid, right?
Yep.
I mean, I hate to say it, but that's what it was. And so let's think of something good that came out of this Apple Intelligence thing as well. It's getting people talking about AI. It's getting people talking about what policy should be in place for this stuff. It's getting people talking about all the different areas where AI is infiltrating or coming into their environment and what they have to do about it. Instead of just saying like, okay, it's not just about Apple Intelligence. Apple Intelligence is one really big thing because it's coming in on everybody's device, but even just their corporate devices, it's coming into call centers, it's coming into Chrome, it's coming into Zoom, it's coming into every place you can think of. You can't ignore the fact that it's someplace and it's coming into all these places. You need to have controls. You need to change your DLP controls. You need to change different things. You can't ignore it. And we were just sitting downstairs watching some parts of I'm at a conference right now, and where it was on 16% of people's spend for last year, whatever, it's on 80% of people's minds for this year, right? So it's growing, obviously, and as it should. And like everything else that's hot on CIOs' minds or everything else, you can't, you can't just say I'm doing AI. You have to have the right problem for it. And so just, these are common themes we always think about. So I'll let this one. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I mean,
I'll add
Go
one more
ahead,
thing, Chris. Most of our conversations in the last 45 minutes have been revolved around IT operations, IT policy, and user community sort of training and education. We also got to think through the implications of the dev side. I read a stat, and whether the number is 70% or 40%, at the end of the day, this is concerning. The stat is in 2024, all new code, 70% of it was actually generated by a machine. A machine can, create a JSON file a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently than I can. And a lot of folks are taking advantage of that. So we got to think through some of the DevOps and ML ops and some of those capabilities on the back end of the software cycle as well.
And I also don't think we've talked enough today about the influence of bias and how that in an AI environment is so devastating. And one thing to consider, I forget the stat on this, so I won't even bother with it right now, but the amount of AI generated content on the web is increasing so fast, faster than all the human content. And since AI is trained on the information that's on the web, it's creating this cycle. And so biases are actually probably going to get worse, not better, because of this. Sometimes AI drift is another term that comes to mind, where all of a sudden we're getting wrong answers because the information out there is so warped. And what I don't think people appreciate enough of is that when they're getting answers from the AI, they start to trust it. I'm really nervous about this in regulated environments like healthcare, finance, and so on, where relying on AI as a source of truth is incredibly dangerous. It's fine to use it for creative purposes or to check your work or to give you new ideas, find problems in your logic, whatever. But when you start to say we're going to totally rely on and trust it, that's dangerous. And I've been in organizations where it's starting to become like that, where they get so used to it being right that 10% of the time when it's not right or more can cause real serious problems. I mean, people can get hurt. Think of a self-driving car as an example. You can't afford that 1% time it's wrong, is the kind of the mindset you have to have with it. So bias is a big issue. Mistakes or misinformation that comes out of these things is a big issue. Think of the other thing that AI represents, and I said this early, at the very beginning, is it's so data hungry that sometimes we skip steps in our governance because we don't look at the quality of the data and the use of the data and the process we use to capture the data. I mean, IoT is a good example of this. You know, IoT is sending so much information. Where is it going? How is it stored? How is it protected? How is it organized? How is it used? And finally, kind of going back to what Robbie was saying before, actually, I think all of you said, is when you really sit down and say, I'm gonna bring AI or recognize I have AI in my environment, how are you aligning that with your business objectives and making sure that there's a clear business case for it, there's a clear value proposition, and also how feasible is it? And so we do a lot of feasibility versus value mapping so that we can prioritize the work we do. Last thing I'll just say about all of this to kind of pull it together is we have to educate our workforces. I've said this several times already, but your best defense against AI problems right now is education, having everyone educated. You're not going to put all the tools you need in place. You need to keep working on that. But systems, processes, policies are all important and valuable, but an educated workforce will do far more for you right now. And I'm saying right now, I'm not saying forever, just because for two reasons. One is the security aspects we've all talked about. There's another thing that I don't think we have talked about, which is when people know how to use AI effectively, they get more value from it. And so think about it, whatever investment you're making in AI, you can magnify that orders of magnitude sometimes by having an educated workforce. So this digital AI literacy I talked about, I really can't stress enough how much that can help you and really lower your risk.
Great. And so, you know, we're in this kind of inflection point where you can't really be in a wait and see mode as an IT leader. Now you kind of have to start to adopt AI. And so there's a lot of, as we've discussed today, a lot of implications on what that means and how to attack it. You know, Scott just brought up a really good point around awareness and education and how to kind of start thinking about that. You know, policy and governance is another big factor there. And, you know, Adam, do you want to touch upon kind of where to start in some advice that you might want to give to the participants here today?
Yeah, you know, certainly the advice I have is to try to do some due diligence on these software products, right? Like at the end of the day, this is a software vendor that's telling you that they have a data center, that they're going to secure the data that you feed, the application. And we have tools in place already in the community to audit this, right? So things like a SOC 2 audit can give you clarity from a third party as to the architecture of the app, where the data is stored, how it's stored, security protocols, things of that nature. The leave behind that I've given to attendees of the webinar today is a simple due diligence sheet that will allow you to take a software application, like let's say Zoom AI Companion, and to find out from the web, from very specific links that are standard on almost every company, what inputs it has, what outputs it can produce, where those are stored within, the software companies, data centers, and allows you to calculate, what kind of risk of data loss that puts in your company based on the use case, the people you have using it, the data you have taking into it, and giving it a score for things like Scott mentioned on bias or hallucinations, basically how faulty is the information it's generating, how inaccurate. And then you can give it a sort of simple score, right? All we're trying to do there when we talk about security awareness is really bring down simplify the conversation so that it's easy for you to speak to legal about what your concerns are. It's easy to speak to your users about what the risks are. It's easy to speak to others about how these things are actually built. So my advice is just to give yourself the same tools you had in the past, to use audits we've given in the past, to look at these software companies not as these new, completely different types of organizations. They still have the same relationship any software or service provider has to you. They're making software, they're putting it in a data center, and you can check the security of all that with the existing programs we have in place.
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of investment, time, effort, and energy that goes into kind of an AI-enabled strategy and kind of leveraging this technology. And there's obviously a reason for it because it gives you good, outputs at a certain point. I'd like to touch upon, kind of how to measure, an ROI on some of the AI investments, and what, some of the participants might look at from like a one-time investment versus like an ongoing continuous investment for an AI strategy and enabling some of these tools today and in the future. Scott, you want to start us off there real quick? Oh, you're on mute, Scott.
Sorry about that. When we're thinking about ROI with AI and the evaluation, I think we said this before, but the first thing to do is look at what your business objectives are, and don't say, how can we bring AI into the organization? Instead, say, what problem are we trying to solve? And then work backwards to, is AI the right solution for that? For instance, I'll give you an example. We've had a lot of clients who have kind of gone down the AI path early. And then when we ask this question, it turns out they're really just trying to automate a process. And you don't need AI for that. And I will tell you, if you don't need AI for something, don't use it. For some of the reasons that we've already talked about today in terms of the risks, but more importantly, because AI is actually more expensive in a lot of ways to run from an infrastructure perspective, knowledge and training perspective, even data perspective, I guess, in some cases. So if you can automate something without it, you should. But where you need complex decision making, where there aren't a clear set of rules that you can program in, AI can shine in those cases. And so all of a sudden you have to look at it and value AI accordingly. So you need to define your business priorities and then make sure AI is aligning with those priorities as a starting point. So I'll just kick us off that way.
Right. Robbie, anything to add there?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm going to leave as a leave behind, I think we put it in the chat, amplix.com/rapid-scale AI assessment. There's a lot of misconception out there in terms of, hey, I want to do AI. I want to enable various business units to be more optimized and streamlined, and I've got a lot of data that I can leverage to do that. And I think this assessment sort of helps you, if used right, to kind of put some scope around it. What are we talking about from a business outcome perspective? What are we trying to do from a validation perspective? So a lot of folks want to jump into AI and want to start building models, but we've talked about for the last hour how we want to really start thinking through first business outcomes. So, how many hours do you want to spend doing that? How many hours do you want to spend validating and maybe in a POC, not all your data, but a subset of your data? How many hours do you want to allocate to building? And then this is important with AI because no AI is perfect. The feedback loop and the input back into the input, if you will, is extremely important. And how much time do you want to spend optimizing? So the summary I put together, I think, can help you kind of think through what the potential ROI could be for any of your internal projects.
Great. And for the folks at home or at their office, I wanted to flash the assessment that Robbie's talking about here, their AI assessment. We also have the Act Zero one. And here's the link as well. Adam, anything to add on your assessment and how they could be leveraging it?
No, just similar to, Scott's framing, right? Like you want to ask yourself almost like a data loss question, right? What data am I putting into this? What data is it generating? What's it going to be used for? And then, of course, auditing the infrastructure, just like any other software app, will help you because you may not be able to fully understand all the vulnerabilities that AI will present. Most of the vendors probably don't even understand all the risks they have as they train these things to get better and better and better and release them quickly. And so, to protect yourself, it's probably good to look at the audit more as what data is going into this, what data is coming out of it, what access does it have to my machines, to my infrastructure, and all those things are quite simple to prosecute using something like a SOC 2 or an ISO audit. And so you'll see examples of that in this spreadsheet when you download it.
And then I'm going to stop sharing real quick. And
Well, you can, the last thing I will say is, if this sounds overwhelming to people, we do have a service specifically for this. We do a lot of work in helping companies with their AI governance and processes at all levels, like from when they're first starting to look at just people using AI within their companies like ChatGPT and what should our policies be, all the way up to we're building software and what's our infrastructure need to be. And so we do have this really simple service that we talk about, the AI benchmark, which is essentially benchmarking where you are in terms of industry best practices and giving you sort of a way to look at what you have working and what you need to work on within your organization to really get to that point. And I will tell you that one of the reasons why I think getting your governance right now is that what we're up against is that the technology is moving faster than people can manage. And so if you don't start putting some of this in place now, you're going to get overwhelmed at some point. And so this is a good time. It's actually not too late, but it is getting late to start putting some of this stuff in place. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that, and I've said this a few times, but I just want to make this really clear. This notion of prompt engineering, the idea of teaching all of your employees how to effectively talk to AI, to large language models especially, can do two things for you. It can absolutely reduce your risk somewhat if they know how to minimize the risk of bad information coming out of the AI by asking the questions in the right way and with the right detailed structure. And two, it can optimize the outputs they get so they work faster. I'm telling you, people go through prompt engineering training. They come out sometimes I've heard 10 times. And I can tell you personally, that's my feeling about it, is that I am 10 times better at using AI than I was before I understood how these things really work. They don't think, so I don't want to say how they think, but the way they work. And so I really stress that if you can get everyone in your organization trained on AI digital literacy and effective prompt engineering, so when they're using these things, they're talking to it in a way that gets the best results, the safest results, you'll minimize the risk. You're not going to get rid of the risk, but you can minimize it. And so I hope it works out for you.
great. We have literally 2 minutes left. I don't know if anybody has any questions. The chat is open. I don't see any questions in there right now. So I guess I'll open it up for any final thoughts from the group. And if not, I think we covered a lot of great data today. And I appreciate all the insight. And we'll be sending out the recording to everybody. But I'll quickly go around the horn. Anybody have any final wisdom to share?
I just can't wait to see the transcription from this webinar. I'm going to put it into my ChatGPT summary, and we'll digest some action items from it. No, seriously, I'm good. It's been a great session. Thank you for everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Well, that will do it for the lesson Apple Intelligence can teach IT leaders about AI. So thanks, everybody, for joining, and keep an eye out for all the future Amplix webinars.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.